In this lesson, we will cover the different options you have when working with multiple objects. In the editor, there are two ways you can combine objects: gluing and grouping. First, let's look at gluing. Here I have these boards that I would like to glue together. There are two ways to glue objects in the editor. The first way is to select all the objects by holding L1. When selecting multiple objects, it's a good idea to select a straight object first, then select the angled objects. This way, the rotation axis will be straight and make it easier to rotate the objects once they are all selected. Once you have all the objects selected, hit up on the D-pad. Any properties that are common to all those objects is displayed here. For now, we will select Glue Objects. Now, all the objects that were selected are glued together. Once the glued objects are glued, this little yellow box will appear with dotted lines connecting every item in the glued group. This little yellow icon also represents the pivot point. Once glued, objects will act as one object. Activate physics on it, and it will move as one big object instead of a number of small objects. Selecting any object in the group will select the whole group. But if you need to select one object in the group, simply hold the left shoulder button, L1, while making your selection. If you hover your cursor over an object for a longer period of time, it will select the whole group. You still need to press X to grab everything, but this is a great way to select multiple objects or multiple glued groups at once. Now let's look at another method you can use to glue objects. If you open the Objects menu, select Tools, Common, Physics, and then you can select the Object Glue tool. This looks like the pivot point icon. Spawn this in the world and open its properties. There are some basic object properties and pivot properties we will need to discuss in a moment, but for now, scroll down to the Select Glue Members option. This will bring up a cursor. Now everything you select will be added to your glue group, and for this method you do not need to hold the shoulder button to make your selections. Once you've selected everything you want to add, hit circle to back out to the Glued Objects property menu. Now let's look at the properties we have. The first item we will look at is Pivot Type. This determines where your pivot point will be. The pivot point acts as the glued object's center of gravity. Moving the pivot point will redistribute the weight of your glued group and change how your object moves and reacts to outside forces when physics are active. Center of mass will place the pivot point based on the mass of the individual glued objects. Center will place it based on the position of the objects, ignoring their weight. And finally, with manual, you can place the pivot point wherever you want by selecting it using the Select Pivot option. Note that it's also possible to grab the pivot point in the editor and move it around, but if you do that, it will automatically change this setting to manual. Back in the main menu, Unglue Object speaks for itself. This will break up the glued group and the objects will go back to being just a pile of objects. Select Pivot is just another way to grab the pivot point of a glued group. You will find this handy when you have a complex glued group and you can't see the pivot point to grab it. With Select Glue Members, you can add more members to a glued group, or selecting an object already in a glued group will remove that object from the glued group. Save to Favorites we will cover in a moment, but first let's cover grouping. You can group objects in the same way that we first glued them. In the editor, select all the objects you want to group, and then open the Properties menu, and this time scroll down and select Group Objects. Now your objects are grouped. The difference between gluing and grouping is, grouping only combines these objects in the editor. If you turn on physics to test these objects, they are still separate objects. Grouping is just an easy way to move, copy, or otherwise work with a number of objects at once. As with the glued group, selecting one item in the group will select the whole group. You can also hold the left shoulder button to select separate items within the group, or hover over an object with the left shoulder button to select the whole group. Now let's check out the properties. Like with the glued objects, the common properties are here in this menu. Most of these properties we've already discussed. We have the option to turn our group into a glued group, or ungroup our objects. Remove from group comes in handy if you want to take an object out of a group. To do this, you need to use the left shoulder button to select the objects you want to remove from the group, open its properties, and select Remove from Group. The final thing we will cover is favorites. The basic idea of favorites is, you can save objects you create in one track and use them in other tracks. So, for example, take this object I've created. I can save it in my favorites, and this will allow me to use it in other tracks. You can save any objects to favorites, but you will usually want to save combinations of objects, like things you build out of other objects. The objects do not have to be grouped or glued to be saved to favorites, but if an object is glued together, you should save the entire glued group. Also, if you have logic connected to an object you wish to save to favorites, you should either save all the logic with the object or disconnect the logic from the object before saving it to favorites. To save to favorites, Select the objects you want to save and go to the Properties menu. Select Save to Favorites, and this will prompt you to select a group to save it to. Each group can contain up to 20 favorites, and all the groups are available to pull from when editing, so you can organize them however you want. Once you've chosen a group, select Save, and you will be prompted to give the object a name. Now you can go to Favorites anytime when in the editor, and you can use the objects you've saved.